we started talking about the Mets a little last segment, but let's talk a little bit more about how their season's gone. And something that we touched upon is the amount of injuries that this team has had to face has really changed more than any team I've really ever followed in my life. The outlook of their season and how you would look back onto it.
Dylan, I am really, really sad. I feel like for people right now, because of the fluctuations too in deGrom by himself, I feel like that is just such a really unfortunate situation. I mean, it's beyond unfortunate. It's like unimaginable. And I mean, yeah, okay, it might just be 2 weeks, but beyond that, I think that injuries in general are just like, you see them and you just see like a DNP on a stat sheet from the outside, right? But like to actually picture it, it's like, wait, oh my God, these people are playing, like we were talking before the show even started, there's so many games, way too many games, some would argue. Thomas Aiello's dad, for one, would say there's too many games in MLB season. There are so many games, there's so much work on these pro players' bodies, and like we're seeing the repercussions of that. And yeah, you get to love a player and you really want them to keep doing well. You want them to be like your saving grace as a fan, but you can't hold on to that. And it's really sad. So I think that it's something that I think is normally a really casual conversation, but there's so much weight to it because it's a person's body too, which I know this might seem like such an obvious statement, but like I actually was really just thinking about that today before when we were talking at the show, before the show. I'm like, that is just an insane thing to even just comprehend by itself.
Well, yeah, you bring up an interesting point, and this is something that you and I discussed in sports in general not long ago when we did one-on-one nightly together. Is in the year following COVID, in this post-COVID world of sports, where most everyone played a shortened season or a truncated season or some kind of adjusted season of sorts in every sport. And now they're trying to get back to a full-length season, or at least something that resembles it, like in the NBA and what the NHL plans on doing this year, what they did last year. You're going to have some injury effects just because, we know how rhythmic sports can be, and I'm sure you can attest to this, but athletes are incredibly rhythmic beings, I'm sure, where you want to get into the rhythm of a season. And when you get out of that, not only does that mess up your rhythm, but health-wise, you're not doing as much. And that's going to have an effect on you. And unfortunately, that's what happened. That is what has happened in baseball, coming off of a 60-game year that they played in 2020, and now trying to go back to the full 162 in a complete 180. If you can get all those numbers there in 2021, and it's had injury effects all over baseball, but it has not affected any team more than the New York Mets. Jacob deGrom has been out for about 2 weeks now. We knew that it was going to be at least another 2 weeks before he was back, but that he would start throwing this week, ideally. And we learned yesterday that it's going to be at least another 2 weeks. He's been shut down for an additional 2 weeks, meaning the earliest that he can pitch this year is going to be mid-September, likely in some kind of reliever role. And even that is pushing things. There's a good chance, Gigi, that he is not going to be able to pitch for the rest of at least the regular season.
And how much do you think that's really going to affect the Mets, too, in this playoff run?
Well, it's a good question. They've spent the last 2 weeks trying to adjust to not having Jacob deGrom. And it looks like they've been trying to schedule their team around the idea of just not having him for the rest of the year, which is, I think, something fans have really taken note of. Mm-hmm. But, at the end of the day, he was the strength of this team, and that's nothing against guys like Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor's effect on the morale of this clubhouse. But, you talk about the strength of this team, it was Jacob deGrom. To not have him is an enormous effect. And you look at some of the most energetic games the Mets have played this year, they're on days when Jacob deGrom has the ball, because there's a confidence that you have. There's an energy you have when you're playing behind the goat, I dare say. But, Gigi, I'm going to have to say, without Jacob deGrom for this stretch of games in the rest of August and into September, when this division is truly on the line, maybe you could argue it shouldn't be, but the fact of the matter is it is. I don't see things turning out well for them without their star pitcher.
Yes, I completely agree. And I wonder too how tonight will go. And I think that something else too is you have Baez coming in and also going out with injuries already, back spasms, which I think that's one thing that could just be so reoccurring too. I think we talked about this earlier on a different episode of 101, how certain injuries could just keep flaring up. And like we see the same problems over and over again for a lot of these players. So I think that especially just bringing Baez in, now you're pulling up Blankenhorn from the AAA Syracuse, and he's only 3 for 15 for the Mets this year. And so how much is that change too also going to affect the Mets? And you said earlier that the Mets are maybe not the most injury-riddled team, but the most affected, obviously, by injuries. And so you have position players, your star pitcher, baseball's star pitcher out for undisclosed amount of time. And I think that it is smart of the Mets organization, although it might be really disappointing for fans because you want to see deGrom on the mound, to plan around just not having him in particular for the rest of the season. That makes sense. And then he could come back and dominate in playoffs if that's possible. And I think that the Mets are well-rounded enough. You've seen that they're well-rounded enough to do it on their own without the star talent of deGrom right now for the next couple of weeks. And yeah, it's going to be very tough series, but having that long stretch of being on top of the division too, that's going to stay with them. I think that it really will provide, beyond confidence, it's going to provide like real hard things that they could rely on, like hashtag cool fact from Dylan Balsamo, just cool facts that they could look back and be like, all right, well, we did that as an individual. I did that, whatever, throughout the lineup. And that they can continue to dominate for the next couple of weeks. And it's even more exciting. I think that something that hopefully the crowd will see in our interview later on is that the underdog story is so amazing too. Like the Mets are meant to be underdogs, in my opinion, at least growing up with the Mets. The only fan I knew that was a Mets fan was my grandma. And I'm like, all right, I'll root for her and I'll root for the Mets. But I think that it's going to be even more fuel to the fire. And I think that will help teams in a way. Yeah, you want to have a consistent cast that you can rely on. But I think that having like a different narrative for the end of the season, coming off the success that you had, actually could help rather than hurt the morale of the team. And then we'll see how that reality actually plays out tonight.
Well, Gigi, you talk about a consistent cast, and I think that's a really important caveat to all of this is the Mets' injury troubles. And as you also mentioned, they are not the only team that has had injury issues. You look at the other two teams competing in the division right now. The Phillies, to a certain extent, the Braves even more so, have had tons of injury troubles. They went and addressed that at the trade deadline. The Dodgers, who they're playing this weekend, have had lots of injury issues themselves. You might argue that's why they are not, of the three teams currently competing in the NL West, the team that's leading things. But, at the end of the day, it is the reality of things. But you talk about a consistent cast. And you bring up, as you mentioned, Travis Blankenhorn, who has not had a ton of time at the plate and is just 3 for 15 in his time. In a year where there's been so many moving parts, the Mets, I believe, have used 59 players in the major leagues this year, which I believe is, if I'm not mistaken, at this point in time, is tied for the league lead with Milwaukee. But the thing is, when you have such a rotating carousel of guys, and no one can get a nice rhythm in of playing every day, and everyone is platoon because they're jumping up and down. And you look at guys who have struggled, like Michael Conforto, for example, who is really fighting for his job at this point. And when he doesn't get to play every day, and he never gets to be in that rhythm. And the fact that the Mets have platooned two of their catchers, James McCann, Tomas Nido recently, and all these different guys who have come up and down, whether you look at Blankenhorn or Patrick Mazeika or Khalil Lee or any of these guys, when such a thing happens, it's tough to get a rhythm. This is something that I had noticed before the trade deadline, is with all these injuries and with guys coming up and down and a lack of consistency in the roster from series to series. that when people were like, well, what are the Mets going to need at the deadline? What I kept saying was, well, it's tough to know that because it's tough to understand what kind of team this is. It was tough to say. You could say emotionally, this is a team that fights, and they're going to give you a fight most every day, and that comes from the spirit of guys like Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor and Don Smith, and you could say as much as you like. But when it comes down to it, it was tough to figure out what the identity of this team was. And then all of a sudden, right after the trade deadline, all the injuries became more clear. And what it was half an infield and half a pitching staff. That's what they really have. So if you're the Mets, you just gotta you're gonna keep fighting. But part of you just kind of has to shrug your shoulders and go, "This is the reality of things."
Wow. That must be so frustrating to be a part of too. And like you're seeing it, you're constantly involved in this. And I'm wondering too, is how important is Conforto for the Mets moving forward? Do they need him to go back to his all-star self? Is that so important? You mentioned him, and I'm just wondering, is this more than a slump for him, do you think? Is it a long-term slump? His current performance, whatever the batting average is, 200, I don't know if you know, but is he a key player for the Mets and someone beyond statistically reliable, just a reliable player that could serve well in their lineup and necessary without deGrom? What do you think about that?
Personally, I think it was just a tough year for him, and he might continue to have it. And, he missed a lot of time with injury. That was a long injury that I don't think he or anyone on the Mets expected to last as long as it did. And he was kind of struggling rhythmically before he left for the injured list. And when he came back, he continued to struggle. Now, this series, he's been hitting very well. I believe he's 6 for 11 to this point. A couple extra base hits in this homestand, I should say. 3 games against the Nationals, the one against the Dodgers. Last night, as we speak, there will be another game as you're listening to this. But what it comes down to is, everyone's going to have a rough year in their career, and Michael Conforto has been around for a while now. His rookie year, I believe, was 2014. So he's been around a while. But that is absolutely a question the Mets are going to need to address is because there's been talk about extending Michael Conforto because his contract is up soon. So the question is how much of a leash do you put on this guy when you struggle? But that's one of the many questions the Mets are going to have to answer.